The steel hull of the M36 tank destroyer radiates warmth against Murphy's back, a cruel comfort in the Vosges Mountains winter that makes him think of the wood stove back home in Texas. But home feels like somebody else's memory now, buried under months of frozen foxholes and the particular silence that settles over eastern France after artillery stops falling. The main gun barrel above his head points uselessly skyward, its traverse mechanism damaged by the same 88-minute round that killed the engine 20 minutes ago. Through the swirling snow, he can count at least 40 German infantry moving behind 3 Panzer IVs, their dark shapes advancing methodically across the white field toward Holzwehr. Company B had taken the village too easily this morning. Murphy knew it even as they cleared the last house, even as Lieutenant Manning set up the command post in the mayor's kitchen and called back to battalion that the objective was secure. The 3rd Infantry Division had been grinding through the Colmar pocket since New Year's Day, and Murphy had learned to read the rhythm of German withdrawals. When they gave ground without a fight, they were usually drawing you into something worse. The radio in the tank destroyer crackles with static and distant voices. Other units calling for artillery, reporting contact, requesting permission to withdraw. Manning's voice cuts through. "Murphy, you copy. We're falling back to the tree line. Can you observe from there and call adjustments?" Murphy keys the handset, watching German infantry spread into assault formation 300 yards out. "Roger that, Lieutenant. I can see them fine from here." What he doesn't say is that from the tree line, he won't be able to see the dead ground behind the stone wall, where at least a squad of Germans is probably moving right now. He doesn't mention that the radio's battery is showing red, or that the tank destroyer's position gives him the only clear field of fire that might break up their attack before it overruns the company's new position. These are the calculations that have kept him alive since Sicily, the mathematics of small unit tactics that nobody teaches you in basic training. Private Carson, the radio operator, appears at Murphy's elbow, his face pale above the wool scarf wrapped around his neck. "Murph, we gotta go. Lieutenant's orders." "You go ahead, Carson. I'll be right behind you." Carson hesitates, glancing at the advancing Germans, then back at Murphy. Something in Murphy's tone must tell him this isn't quite true, because he starts to say something else, then just nods and disappears into the snow. Through the howling wind, Murphy can hear boots crunching toward the rear, carrying his squad to safety, while he settles against the warm steel and checks his ammunition. 8 clips for the M1 Garand, enough to make this interesting. The lead panzer reaches the 200-yard mark, its turret traversing slowly as the crew searches for targets. Murphy can see the tank commander's head above the cupola, a young face under a black beret, probably no older than Murphy's own 20 years. Behind the armor, German infantry advance with the confidence of veterans, weapons ready but unhurried, trusting the steel to absorb whatever the Americans might throw at them. Murphy settles the Garand against his shoulder and finds his natural point of aim on a German sergeant directing movement behind the leftmost tank. The crosshairs settle just below the man's collar, and Murphy begins the familiar ritual of controlled breathing and steady pressure that has become as automatic as walking. First shot drops the sergeant. Second shot takes the radio man beside him. By the 4th shot, the neat German formation has dissolved into scattered men seeking whatever cover the frozen field provides. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The Panzer I-4s respond to Murphy's rifle fire by accelerating their advance, but their supporting infantry remains pinned behind whatever cover they can find in the snow-covered field. Murphy shifts position between the tank destroyer's road wheels, using every piece of the vehicle's bulk to shield himself while maintaining clear lines of sight toward the advancing armor. The Vosges Mountains stretch endlessly around him, their pine-covered slopes disappearing into low clouds that promise more snow before nightfall. From the tree line behind him, Murphy can hear Manning's voice on another radio, calling for artillery support from the division's 105mm batteries, positioned somewhere in the hills south of Colmar. The forward observer promises rounds on target in 8 minutes, but 8 minutes is an eternity when German armor is closing at 30 miles per hour. Murphy works through another clip, targeting anyone who shows leadership initiative among the scattered infantry, watching the German advance lose cohesion as officers and NCOs fall to his increasingly precise marksmanship. Private Kerrigan appears at the rear of the tank destroyer, his Springfield rifle clutched in mittened hands. "Murphy, Lieutenant says get your ass back here now. Tell the lieutenant I'm adjusting fire for the artillery." "There ain't gonna be no artillery if you're dead." Murphy doesn't look away from his scope picture, tracking a German machine gun team trying to set up behind a low stone wall. "Then I better not die." Kerrigan stares at him for a long moment, snow accumulating on his helmet. "You're crazy, you know that?" "Probably." The M1 Garand barks again, and the German machine gunner slumps over his weapon. Kerrigan shakes his head and disappears back toward the tree line, leaving Murphy alone with the approaching armor and the steady rhythm of aimed fire that has become his private war against the advancing enemy. Through the snow, he can see German infantry trying to reorganize behind the lead tank, but every time someone stands up to give orders, Murphy's rifle finds them. The 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting in these mountains for 3 weeks now, pushing through villages with names Murphy can't pronounce, grinding forward against an enemy that knew every ridge and valley like their own backyard. The Germans fought differently here than they had in Italy, more desperate, more willing to spend lives for ground that might not matter to anyone except the men dying for it. Murphy had learned to read the signs, the way German officers exposed themselves to rally their men, the increasing frequency of counterattacks that should have been hopeless, the sound of young voices shouting orders in accented German. The lead panzer reaches 100 yards, close enough for Murphy to see the whitewash winter camouflage on its turret and the spare track links hanging from its glacis plate. The tank commander has buttoned up now, his head disappearing behind the cupola as Murphy's rifle fire becomes too accurate to ignore. But without infantry support, the tank is vulnerable to the American bazooka teams that Manning has positioned in the tree line, and the German commander seems to realize this. The Panzer stops, its engine idling while the crew decides whether to advance alone or wait for their scattered infantry to reorganize. Murphy makes the decision for them, shifting his aim to the German squad leader, trying to rally his men behind a pile of rubble that might once have been someone's garden wall. The Garand cracks, and the squad leader pitches forward into the snow. The German infantry, already shaken by the steady rifle fire from an enemy they can't locate, finally breaks. Murphy watches them stream back toward their start line, abandoning the tanks to advance without support. The Panzer commander makes the only reasonable choice and begins reversing his vehicle, unwilling to face American anti-tank weapons without infantry cover. The other 2 tanks follow, and within minutes the entire German attack has dissolved into a confused withdrawal across the snow-covered field. The promised artillery begins falling 5 minutes later, long rounds that explode harmlessly in the woods beyond the German position. Murphy keys the radio and begins walking the fire onto target with coordinates called in the flat, emotionless tone that artillery forward observers learn in training. Drop 200, left 50. Fire for effect. The next salvo brackets the retreating German armor perfectly, high explosive rounds throwing up geysers of snow and frozen earth around the tanks. One Panzer throws a track and slews sideways, its crew bailing out to disappear into the pine forests that stretch eastward toward the Rhine. The other tanks accelerate their withdrawal, leaving the disabled vehicle burning in the field like a monument to the morning's failed attack. From the tree line, Murphy can see his company moving back toward their original positions, dark figures against the snow carrying weapons and wounded men. Carson appears first, sliding into the cover behind the tank destroyer with his radio and a thermos of coffee that steams in the cold air. "Lieutenant says you did good, Murph. Real good." Murphy doesn't feel good. He feels cold and tired and strangely empty, the way he always feels after a firefight when the adrenaline fades and leaves nothing behind except the memory of crosshairs settling on faces that look too young to be carrying rifles. The M1 Garand rests hot against his knees, its steel and wood construction as reliable as the West Texas sky. But Murphy can't stop his hands from shaking now that the immediate danger has passed. "How many you figure you got?" Carson asks, pouring coffee into a metal cup. "Don't know, wasn't counting, but that's a lie and they both know it." Murphy always counts, the same way he counts ammunition and measures distances and calculates fields of fire. 7 confirmed kills, maybe 10, if you included the men who fell to artillery he'd adjusted. 7 families in Germany who would receive telegrams written in careful bureaucratic language that wouldn't mention the snow or the cold, or the way their sons had looked through rifle scopes in the moments before Murphy squeezed the trigger. Lieutenant Manning approaches through the snow, his face grim above the collar of his field jacket. "Murphy, I want you to know that was against direct orders." "Yes, sir." "You were supposed to fall back with the rest of the company." "Yes, sir." Manning stares at him for a long moment, then shakes his head. "Battalion wants a full report. They're talking about putting you in for another medal." Murphy doesn't say anything to that. He's already got medals from Sicily and Anzio, ribbons that his mother keeps in a shoebox back in Hunt County, along with letters he sends home that never mention firefights or artillery or the particular weight of other men's lives in your hands. The 3rd Infantry Division had been handing out decorations since they landed in North Africa, and Murphy has learned that medals are just the Army's way of putting numbers on things that don't translate into numbers. "Sir," Murphy finally says, "those tanks'll be back. Maybe not today, but they'll be back." "I know. That's why we're digging in here for the night instead of falling back to regiment." The snow continues to fall as the company establishes defensive positions around Holtzwihr, men with shovels and entrenching tools scraping holes in ground that's frozen solid beneath 6 inches of powder. Murphy helps Carson string communications wire between the tank destroyer and Manning's command post, ordinary soldier work that feels strange after the morning's violence. By evening, the village looks like an armed camp, with machine gun positions covering the approaches and mortar crews registered on likely avenues of attack. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy dreams of burning tanks and wakes to the sound of German artillery walking across the village in methodical salvos that shake snow from the rafters of the barn where his squad has spent the night. Dawn comes grey and bitter cold over the Vosges Mountains, revealing fresh German positions dug into the tree line across the field, positions that weren't there when Murphy fell asleep 4 hours earlier. Manning's voice crackles over the radio. "All positions. This is 6. Enemy armor approaching from the north. Estimate company strength with supporting infantry." Through the barn door, Murphy can see them. At least 6 tanks this time, advancing in a loose wedge formation with what looks like 2 companies of infantry spread out behind them. The Germans have learned from yesterday's failure and brought enough men to overwhelm any single defensive position, enough firepower to smash through the American line regardless of casualties. Murphy grabs his rifle and ammunition, checking the clips with the automatic precision of a man who has done this too many times before. Carson is already at the radio trying to raise the artillery batteries, but the response is discouraging. The 105s are supporting another attack 15 kilometers south and won't be available for counter-battery fire until noon at the earliest. "We're on our own until then," Manning announces over the command net. "Hold your positions and make every shot count." But Murphy can see what Manning can't from the command post. The German advance is too strong, too well coordinated. They'll overrun the American positions within 20 minutes, and there aren't enough men in Company B to stop them. The tank destroyer sits at the road junction like a steel island, its main gun still pointing skyward, useless against approaching armor, but perfectly positioned to command the entire German approach route. Murphy looks at the disabled vehicle, then at the advancing Germans, and makes the kind of calculation that separates legend from ordinary courage. The tank destroyer's 50 caliber machine gun is still functional, mounted on a pintle that gives it a complete field of fire. More importantly, the vehicle's ammunition storage includes several hundred rounds of armor-piercing incendiary that will punch through anything except the heaviest tank armor. Carson, Murphy says, you get back to the command post. Tell the lieutenant I'm staying with the TD. Murph, that thing's a sitting duck. First tank round'll cook you alive. Maybe. But that gun'll reach out and touch somebody before they get me. Carson stares at him, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. Jesus, Murphy, you can't hold that position alone. Watch me. Murphy is already moving toward the tank destroyer, his rifle slung and his hands checking ammunition pouches with the automatic precision of long practice. Behind him, Carson keys the radio to report to Manning, but Murphy doesn't wait to hear the lieutenant's response. The German armor is 800 yards out and closing fast, and there isn't time for discussions about reasonable tactics or acceptable losses. The 50 caliber machine gun comes alive under Murphy's hands like a familiar tool, its mechanisms as comfortable as the controls of his father's tractor back in Texas. He feeds a belt of armor-piercing rounds into the weapon and settles behind the sights, waiting for the advancing Germans to close within effective range. The tank destroyer's steel hull provides cover from small arms fire, but Murphy knows that the first tank round to hit the vehicle will turn it into a crematorium. The mathematics are simple. Kill enough Germans fast enough to break their attack before they kill him. The lead panzer reaches 400 yards and Murphy opens fire. The 50 caliber machine gun hammers against Murphy's shoulder with a rhythm like a pneumatic drill, its armor-piercing rounds stitching across the German formation in long, devastating bursts. The first tank in the advancing wedge slews sideways as Murphy's fire finds the vision ports, blinding the driver and sending the 30-ton vehicle careening into a drainage ditch where it throws a track and becomes a stationary target. Murphy shifts fire to the supporting infantry, watching German soldiers scatter as the heavy machine gun rounds tear through their ranks with lethal precision. The 50 caliber doesn't just kill, it disintegrates, turning men into red mist and fragments that paint the snow in patterns that will haunt Murphy's dreams for decades. But he doesn't think about that now, focusing instead on the mechanical process of target selection and trigger control that keeps him alive from second to second. A second panzer swings its turret toward the tank destroyer, and Murphy sees the muzzle flash an instant before the 75mm round screams past his head to explode against a stone wall 50 yards behind him. The German gunner has the range, but not the deflection, and Murphy uses the few seconds while the tank reloads to rake its infantry support with another long burst that sends survivors diving for whatever cover they can find. The radio beside him crackles with Manning's voice. "Murphy, get out of there! That's a direct order." But Murphy is beyond orders now, operating in the strange calm that descends during close combat, when everything except the immediate tactical problem fades into irrelevance. He feeds another belt into the machine gun and continues firing, methodically destroying the German attack one target at a time. A Panzerfaust round, fired by desperate infantry streaks past the tank destroyer to explode harmlessly in an empty field, its operator killed by Murphy's return fire before he can reload. What the citation won't mention, what no after-action report will capture, is the moment when Murphy realizes he's probably going to die on this frozen road in eastern France, and discovers that the knowledge doesn't frighten him as much as he thought it would. There's a strange peace in accepting the mathematics of small unit tactics when they point toward certain death, a clarity that comes from reducing complex moral questions to the simple problem of keeping the machine gun fed and on target. The German attack begins to waver as casualties mount and the promised armor support proves unable to advance through Murphy's devastating fire. Tank commanders button up and reverse course rather than face the sustained, heavy machine gun fire, leaving their infantry without the steel shield they need to close with the American positions. Within 15 minutes, the coordinated assault dissolves into scattered groups of men seeking escape routes back toward their own lines. When the guns finally fall silent, Murphy finds himself alone again with the smoking machine gun and the peculiar silence that follows combat. His hands shake as he clears the weapon and checks for approaching threats, the adrenaline finally catching up with him now that the immediate danger has passed. Around the tank destroyer, the snow is no longer white. Carson appears first, sliding up from the rear with his radio and a look of something approaching awe. Murphy, Jesus Christ. I counted at least 40 Germans. Don't know about that. But Murphy does know, and the knowledge sits in his stomach like a cold stone. 40 men who woke up this morning thinking about home, about girlfriends and wives and mothers who would receive telegrams written by officers who had never seen their sons die. The machine gun had been brutally effective, and Murphy's marksmanship had turned a defensive position into a slaughter pen that no reasonable person should have been able to hold alone. The secret that will never make it into the official reports is simpler and more terrible than heroism. For 20 minutes on a frozen road in the Vosges Mountains, Audie Murphy became a perfectly efficient killing machine, and the efficiency frightened him more than the dying ever had. Lieutenant Manning arrives with the rest of the company as Murphy sits against the tank destroyer's warm hull, methodically cleaning the .50 caliber machine gun with the obsessive precision of a man who needs familiar routines to hold larger thoughts at bay. The lieutenant surveys the field with the expression of someone trying to reconcile what he sees with what he knows should be possible for a single soldier to accomplish. Murphy, I'm putting you in for the Medal of Honor. Don't want it, sir. That's not really your choice. Manning's voice carries the weight of a man who understands that some actions transcend normal military recognition, that what Murphy did on this road will require an explanation that satisfies people who weren't here to smell the cordite and see the snow turn red. The mathematics of after-action reports demand heroes and clear victories, neat categories that make sense to staff officers reading typewritten summaries in warm offices far from the Vosges Mountains. Carson sets up his radio and begins calling in the morning's casualty reports to battalion headquarters, his voice carefully neutral as he translates Murphy's private war into the precise language of military bureaucracy. Enemy attack repulsed with heavy losses. Estimate 40 enemy KIA, friendly casualties none. The words feel inadequate, like trying to describe a symphony by counting the notes. Over the following weeks, as the 3rd Infantry Division continues its advance toward the Rhine, the story of Murphy's stand at Holzwehr grows in the telling. Officers who weren't there add details that sound better in official reports. War correspondents reshape the narrative into something that will inspire readers back home. The burning tank destroyer becomes a symbol of American determination, and Murphy's name appears in newspapers across the country alongside words like hero and inspiration. But Murphy himself grows quieter as the story spreads, withdrawing into the kind of silence that his squadmates learn to respect. Carson notices that Murphy no longer jokes during the long night watches, no longer joins the card games that help pass time between operations. The machine gun's efficiency has left something broken inside him that medals can't repair and citations can't acknowledge. Years later, when interviewers ask Murphy about his wartime experiences, he will speak carefully around the edges of days like this one, describing the cold and the snow and the weight of responsibility, but never the moment when killing became as automatic as breathing. Some truths are too heavy for public consumption, too personal for the neat categories that turn complex men into simple symbols. The official citation will read, Second Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and his refusal to give ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction and enabled it to hold the vital strong point until relief arrived. Clean words that capture nothing of the machine gun's methodical rhythm or the way German voices sounded when they cried for help in a language Murphy couldn't understand. But Carson remembers the silence after the guns stopped firing, and the way Murphy's hands shook as he cleaned weapons that didn't need cleaning. Manning remembers the expression on Murphy's face when they told him about the medal, the look of a man receiving news of his own funeral. These are the details that don't make it into the official histories, the human weight that legends can't carry. On winter mornings for the rest of his life, Murphy will wake to the smell of cordite that isn't there, and the sound of tank engines that exist only in memory. The medal sits in a box in his closet, but the real weight of that day in the Vosges Mountains sits somewhere deeper, in places that ceremonies can't reach and citations can't heal. The legend belongs to history, but the man who created it belongs to the private silence that follows all wars home. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.